The early summer sunlight streamed through the windows of the modern apartment building in suburban Boston, gently illuminating Margaret Hudson's apartment. Margaret was making corrections with a red pen on a manuscript spread across her kitchen counter, occasionally glancing out the window. Her thin lips were habitually drawn tight with tension, but they softened into a natural smile when she caught sight of her son Oliver. "Oliver, you need to start getting ready soon," she called, opening the window slightly to address her 12-year-old son who was absorbed in reading in the garden. Oliver looked up at his mother's voice and nodded quietly. He resembled Margaret, with a slender build and delicate features, but his eyes held a composure and observational awareness beyond his years. "Do we really have to go to the party today?" Oliver asked as he returned to the room. Margaret gently stroked her son's head. "Yes, we have to go. Grandma Eleanor and Aunt Victoria are expecting us." Though she didn't say it aloud, Margaret herself wasn't looking forward to it either. Her relationship with her mother and sister had grown even more strained after her divorce. Victoria, in particular, who had succeeded as a prominent obstetrician, sometimes mocked Margaret's editorial job at a small culinary publishing house as more like a hobby. As she took a clean polo shirt from the dresser, Margaret gazed at her reflection in the mirror. Her once radiant blonde hair had faded somewhat, and signs of fatigue showed beneath her eyes. Financial worries, the pressure of raising a child alone, and above all, the mental burden of always being labeled a failure by her family were gradually wearing her down. "Mom, is this okay?" Oliver returned to the room, having finished changing. "Perfect, sweetheart," Margaret answered while adjusting his collar. Looking into Oliver's serious eyes, she suppressed her own anxiety. "Let's try to have fun today. I promise." Their small used car headed toward an upscale neighborhood in the Boston suburbs. As the surroundings became more refined, Margaret unconsciously straightened her back and gripped the steering wheel tighter. Victoria's new mansion stood majestically on a lush green hill. The 3-story house was so large that Margaret's entire apartment could fit into a single room. "What an amazing house," Oliver remarked quietly. "Yes, it is," Margaret replied, maintaining her composure. "But what really matters is the people who live in it." After parking, a man wearing an elegant apron approached them. "Welcome, Ms. Margaret and young Oliver," the man greeted them with a warm smile. "Joseph." Oliver's face brightened. Joseph was the chef who had served the Victoria household for over 10 years. His gentle eyes reflected wisdom gained from life experience. "What are you cooking today?" Oliver asked excitedly. "That's a secret," Joseph winked before turning to Margaret. "Everyone is in the backyard." Margaret placed her hand on Oliver's shoulder and took a deep breath. "Let's go." In the garden, Margaret's mother Eleanor sat beneath an elegant parasol. Her refined attire reflected her status in Boston society. "Margaret, you're late," Eleanor said without looking at her daughter. "Victoria has already started preparing the meat." "Hello, Mother," Margaret responded, trying to sound cheerful. "Your new house is lovely. Victoria and Richard have really worked hard," Eleanor's face glowed with pride. "Richard's medical clinic is doing well, and they're living such a happy life." The implication was a comparison with Margaret's own life. "Oliver, Connor is playing in the back," Eleanor finally said. Oliver looked up at his mother. When Margaret nodded, he hesitantly walked toward where his cousin Connor was. Connor, 14, was Victoria and Richard's son. "How is Oliver doing in school?" Eleanor asked as she watched her grandson leave. "Very well. His teachers often." "Connor recently became the state champion in a mathematics competition," Eleanor interrupted Margaret. "Victoria and Richard are thrilled. He's such a talented boy." Margaret maintained her smile and simply replied, "Yes, he is." At that moment, Joseph passed by and whispered to her, "No matter what happens today, don't let it get to you." Margaret looked at him in surprise, but Joseph had already moved on toward the elaborate grilling equipment. Before she could ponder the meaning of his mysterious words, Margaret heard Victoria's voice.
Do you know some people earn over $10,000 a month just by posting Reddit stories on YouTube? No face, no voice, just a laptop. I do it too, link below if you're curious.
Oh, Margaret. You finally made it. Victoria crossed the garden in her perfect hairstyle and expensive summer dress. Her husband Richard walked beside her. Sorry I'm late, Margaret said. Oliver's homework was. It's fine, Victoria waved her hand dismissively. We're used to waiting for you. Richard pointed to the luxurious grill. I've prepared something special today. Prime grade T-bone steaks. I got them from the finest butcher. How wonderful, Margaret said. Near the grill, she could see Joseph explaining something to Oliver, who was nodding with a serious expression. Margaret watched her son, praying they could get through today's party peacefully. However, the atmosphere in the backyard gradually grew heavy. It wasn't just the early summer heat. Margaret sat quietly at the edge of the terrace, observing her family. Richard stood by the grill, proudly introducing his expensive cooking equipment to the guests. His tall stature and confident demeanor reflected his self-esteem as a successful physician. This is a top-of-the-line German model. The temperature control is perfect and brings out the maximum flavor in the meat, he explained to several couples invited from the neighborhood. I've prepared prime-grade T-bone steaks today. They're like works of art in meat form. Victoria was talking with Mother Eleanor on the opposite side of the garden about their well-tended roses. Even from a distance, the two looked remarkably similar, sharing the same graceful gestures and good manners. Occasionally, their laughter echoed through the garden. Margaret felt that she alone couldn't blend into this luxurious scene. Her simple summer dress seemed plain compared to Victoria's designer outfit. Mom, look. Oliver came running up, interrupting Margaret's thoughts. He was holding several vegetables. Joseph showed me the vegetables he grows in the garden. He taught me that homegrown vegetables taste completely different. Yes, that's true, Margaret smiled at her son's enthusiasm. Oliver's eyes were shining with excitement. This was his true self, a child full of curiosity who loved learning. Here, however, he tended to be overshadowed by his cousin Connor. Where's Connor? Margaret asked. Oliver's expression clouded slightly. He's showing everyone his new smartphone. He showed it to me too, but... He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. He doesn't really. Oliver. Connor's voice interrupted. The 14-year-old boy approached with confident strides. Hello, Aunt, he gave Margaret a slight nod before turning back to Oliver. Dad's about to start grilling the meat. He says it's a special T-bone. Have you ever eaten steak before? The question clearly had a malicious tone. Margaret worried about how her son would respond, but Oliver answered calmly. Of course I have. Mom makes it for special occasions. Oh, really? Connor's expression showed he didn't believe it. Well, today's is real premium meat. You'll be surprised. After he left, Margaret gently embraced her son's shoulders. It's okay, Oliver. Oliver nodded slightly. Joseph told me that people who are truly worthy don't need to look down on others. Margaret looked at her son in surprise. Joseph said that. Yes. He knows a lot of things, Oliver said with a serious expression. Not just about cooking, about life too. This conversation was interrupted when Victoria called everyone to take their seats. The large outdoor dining table was decorated with expensive tableware and crystal glasses. Everyone, please gather around. Victoria announced with a perfect hostess smile. Richard and Joseph have prepared wonderful food for us. All the guests began gathering at the table. Margaret and Oliver were guided to seats at the end of the table. Margaret knew this wasn't coincidental. The family hierarchy was reflected in the seating arrangement. Joseph began quietly serving the food. His movements showed an elegance born of years of experience. As he passed by Oliver, he gave the boy a knowing look. Oliver smiled back slightly. Richard proudly brought a platter of steaks. "Here's today's main dish. The finest T-bone steaks." Eleanor clapped her hands delightedly. "Richard, you have such good taste. Only the best is appropriate for our family." Margaret sensed that this "we" didn't include her. It meant Victoria, Richard, Connor, and Eleanor. The meat was carved and served. Connor received a thick, juicy slice. "This special piece is for Connor," Richard said. "A future doctor needs quality protein." Next, similarly impressive cuts were served to Eleanor, Victoria, and Richard himself. Finally, Joseph placed a plate in front of Oliver. It was clearly different from the others. On Oliver's plate was a piece from the edge of the steak, a burnt, tough chunk of fat. It wasn't appetizing, it looked more like scraps. Margaret gasped. She felt blood rushing to her cheeks. But before she could say anything, Eleanor laughed and said, "That should be enough, right? For a child like Oliver, this kind of meat is plenty." Victoria also smirked. Dog food would look more appetizing. Around the table, the invited guests uncomfortably lowered their gazes. Margaret felt her body trembling with anger. She was about to stand up when Oliver gently grabbed her arm. He quietly looked at his plate and said in a calm voice, "Mom, I'm satisfied with this meat." Those words showed a maturity unexpected in a 12-year-old child. Margaret looked at her son, fighting back tears. She began to notice something different. In Oliver's eyes was not fear or sadness, but a strange calmness. As if he knew something. From the corner of the table, Joseph quietly observed the scene. His expression was unreadable, but when he looked at Oliver, something, a sense of understanding and solidarity, flickered in his eyes. Richard seemed a bit dissatisfied with Oliver's reaction but quickly returned his attention to his own luxurious steak. "Well, let's eat," he declared. Margaret was still upset, but guided by Oliver's calm demeanor, she quietly returned to her seat. Her heart was full of complex emotions, anger at her family's cruelty and pride in her son's remarkable dignity. As the meal progressed, the table conversation increasingly excluded Margaret and Oliver. Victoria boasted about Connor's academic achievements and success in tennis tournaments, while Eleanor constantly praised her grandson. Richard talked about his clinic and the famous patients he had recently accepted. Throughout all this, Oliver continued eating quietly. He carefully cut the burnt piece of meat, eating it bit by bit. Occasionally, he glanced toward Joseph, and the chef would subtly nod back. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere at the table gradually changed. Richard and Victoria opened one expensive wine after another, filling their glasses. Their laughter grew louder, and their attitudes became increasingly overbearing. "This wine is from a limited California production. You can't find it in regular markets," Richard declared, raising his glass. "It was a special gift from a prominent patient." Victoria responded with a sophisticated laugh. "Our clients are really generous, aren't they?" Eleanor nodded contentedly, saying, "Success attracts success." The words clearly contained a barb directed at Margaret. Margaret continued eating in silence. Although a regular steak had been placed on her plate, she felt guilty even for that, considering how Oliver had been treated. She occasionally checked on her son. Oliver was surprisingly calm, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen. Joseph returned to the terrace and quietly replenished the large salad bowl. As he passed by Oliver, he whispered in a small voice, "Come to the kitchen after the meal. I have a special dessert just for you." Oliver nodded slightly, and Margaret overheard the conversation. She felt relief but also a strange premonition. Why was Joseph being so kind to Oliver? "Margaret, how is your company doing?" Eleanor suddenly asked. Her tone contained feigned interest. "That small cookbook, what was it again?" It's a publishing house, Mother, Margaret answered, maintaining her composure. It's going well. In fact, we're planning to publish a new book by a famous chef next month. Oh, really? Eleanor said disinterestedly. But can you really make a living with such a small company? Oliver needs a better education, doesn't he? Before Margaret could answer, Victoria interrupted. Connor is going to Exeter Private School next year. His admission is already confirmed. Thanks to Richard's connections, she said proudly. That's wonderful, Victoria, Eleanor beamed at her daughter. The conversation once again flowed in a direction that excluded Margaret and Oliver. Connor took out his smartphone and began playing games under the table. Rather than scolding him, the adults ignored his behavior. Suddenly, Richard stopped mid-sentence. A strange expression crossed his face. I feel a bit. He stammered. What's wrong, Richard? Victoria asked. Richard clutched his stomach and began to say, my stomach feels. But his face suddenly contorted. I need to use the bathroom. The moment he stood up, Eleanor also changed color. I also feel. She too clutched her stomach as she rose. Surprisingly, Victoria and Connor also began showing similar symptoms. Connor's face turned pale, and he complained, my stomach hurts. Margaret stood up, unable to comprehend the situation. Are you all right? What happened? Joseph appeared with a salad bowl, calmly observing the situation. It seems like food poisoning, he said matter-of-factly. Despite her panic, Margaret noticed that Oliver wasn't showing any symptoms at all. The guests sitting nearby also seemed slightly unwell, but not as severely as Richard's family. Oliver, are you okay? Margaret asked her son worriedly. Oliver looked at her calmly and answered in a tranquil voice, Mom, I told you, didn't I? I'm satisfied with this meat. In that moment, a chill ran down Margaret's spine. She began to understand the meaning behind her son's words. Oliver had known from the beginning, was that burnt piece of meat meant to protect him? Victoria tried to rush to the bathroom but stumbled midway, clinging to a terrace pillar. What's happening, this meat? She said painfully. In Margaret's mind, the puzzle pieces rapidly began falling into place. She looked for Joseph. The chef was quietly clearing plates, and when he noticed her gaze, he slightly narrowed his eyes. Joseph. Margaret said softly. Did you do something? Joseph approached her and answered in a low voice, I did nothing. Sometimes premium meat can have issues. His eyes revealed a mixture of determination and satisfaction. Fear and understanding simultaneously struck Margaret. She understood the true meaning of Oliver's calm expression, his mysterious bond with Joseph, and his words, I'm satisfied with this meat. Oliver had known all along. Richard had collapsed in the entrance hall, sitting on the floor. Call an ambulance, he said painfully. Margaret quickly took out her smartphone and called 911. We have an emergency. Suspected food poisoning. Multiple people are affected. After hanging up, she went to Oliver, kneeled down, and looked into her son's eyes. Oliver, are you really okay? Don't you feel anything? Oliver answered calmly, I'm fine. I didn't eat that meat. Didn't eat it? But I saw you. I was pretending, Oliver said quietly. Joseph taught me. He said, sometimes acting is necessary. Margaret gasped. But why? At that moment, Joseph approached. The ambulance should arrive soon, he said in a calm voice. Don't worry. The amount isn't life-threatening. Just a lesson. Margaret stood up and grabbed Joseph's arm. Did you do something to the meat? Joseph led her toward the kitchen, making sure no one could hear them. Ms. Margaret, your son is a wonderful child. He has true compassion and dignity. Meanwhile, the people in this house. He seemed to be choosing his words. They have treated me as less than human for years. Margaret covered her mouth with a trembling hand. But this is a crime, yes, Joseph quietly admitted. But don't worry. I use special herbs that only cause temporary discomfort. There will be no long-term effects. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. Margaret waited for the ambulance in confusion and shock. Oliver sat on the living room sofa, calmly looking out the window. Margaret sat beside her son. Why didn't you tell me? Oliver looked into his mother's eyes and answered, I didn't want to worry you. And he faltered. What they've done to you and me, to Joseph. I thought they needed a small lesson. Margaret trembled at her son's words. Complex emotions of fear and understanding swirled within her. She couldn't believe Oliver had thought so deeply and made such a decision. The ambulance arrived, and medical staff rushed into the house. Richard, Victoria, Eleanor, and Connor were carried out on stretchers. Their faces were pale, contorted with pain. Margaret stood at the entrance, watching this scene. Her heart was full of complex emotions. Reflecting on the mental abuse she and her son had endured for years, she could understand Joseph's actions. However, she was also a law-abiding citizen. Mom, Oliver held her hand. What should we do? Margaret took a deep breath and firmed her resolve. We'll go to the hospital. And she hesitated momentarily. And we must tell the truth. The plastic chairs lining the hospital corridor were hard. Margaret clutched a coffee cup with both hands in the waiting room, occasionally glancing toward the examination room door. Oliver sat quietly next to her, reading a book. His composed figure seemed too grown up. 3 hours had passed. Richard, Victoria, Eleanor, and Connor, who had been brought in by ambulance, were receiving treatment in separate hospital rooms. Margaret had been questioned several times by nurses about the situation, but she wanted to hear the doctor's diagnosis before revealing the truth. Ms. Hudson, a middle-aged female doctor in a white coat, entered the waiting room. May I speak with you? Margaret stood up. Oliver, wait here, please. Oliver nodded silently. His eyes held a mixture of anxiety and determination. The doctor's office was small but orderly. Various medical degrees adorned the walls. I'm Dr. Green, she introduced herself before looking seriously at Margaret. Your family members are stable. Their lives are not in danger, but they're showing quite serious food poisoning symptoms. What's particularly interesting is that this differs from typical bacterial food poisoning. Margaret felt her hands trembling with tension. What do you mean? The test results detected a special plant-based component. It's a type of herb found in nature, but not normally used in cooking, Dr. Green frowned. Ms. Hudson, do you know anything about this? Margaret took a deep breath and made up her mind. Yes, but first, when will their condition improve? They should recover within 24 hours. There will be no permanent damage, the doctor answered. However, we need to understand how this situation occurred. Margaret nodded. I understand. I'll tell you everything. She left the office and returned to Oliver. It's time to talk, she said gently. Oliver closed his book and looked straight into his mother's eyes. About Joseph too. Everything. But first, tell me your story. How did this happen? Oliver took a deep breath. His voice was small but surprisingly steady. It started 6 months ago. I began showing Joseph the food samples you brought home from the publishing house. He was always kind and taught me a lot about cooking. But that wasn't all. Oliver paused slightly. Joseph, he had been treated terribly by Aunt Victoria and Uncle Richard for years. They looked down on him as a servant, not treating him like a human being. Especially Uncle Richard, who would fine him for every mistake, force him to work on holidays. Margaret gasped. I didn't know that. Joseph endured it for over 10 years. But he said what hurt him most was how they treated you and me. Especially today's barbecue, which seems to have been planned well in advance. Joseph overheard Richard saying, "The edge pieces are good enough for the kid." Anger flashed in Oliver's eyes. When Joseph heard that, he decided to teach them a lesson. And he told you about his plan? Margaret asked incredulously. Oliver nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. He gave me a choice. To stop the plan or to cooperate. He hesitated. I chose to cooperate. But I made him promise that no one would really get hurt. Joseph said, "This isn't a life-threatening poison. They'll recover overnight. Just a lesson." Margaret was overwhelmed with complex emotions. She was shocked by the fact that her son had participated, but at the same time remembered the years of insults and humiliation they had endured. "Mom, don't hate me," Oliver's voice trembled. For the first time, he showed the anxiety of a 12-year-old child. Margaret embraced her son. "I could never hate you. You're strong and compassionate." She choked on her words. "But this is against the law. Do you understand?" Oliver nodded quietly. "I know. That's why we need to apologize to Joseph." Margaret nodded and stood up. "First, we must tell Dr. Green the truth." They returned to the doctor's office. Margaret told everything: Joseph's motives, Oliver's involvement, and the family's treatment over the years. Dr. Green listened quietly, occasionally taking notes. "I understand," Dr. Green finally said. "This needs to be reported to the police, but I'll also explain the situation. Your child's involvement will be considered in light of his age." Margaret nodded gratefully. As they left the office, they saw Joseph at the end of the hallway. He was walking quietly, accompanied by a security guard. He had turned himself in to the police. "Joseph!" Oliver ran toward him. Joseph smiled and placed his hand on Oliver's shoulder. "It's okay, Oliver. I'm taking responsibility for my actions. That's what adults do." He turned to Margaret. "I'm sorry, Miss Hudson. I've put you and Oliver in a difficult situation." Margaret looked at him with mixed feelings. Why? Why go so far? Joseph's eyes revealed years of pain and determination. There's a limit to what a human can endure. But what I found most unbearable was what they did to Oliver. He has a special soul. I couldn't stand by and watch them trample on his purity. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. She couldn't condone Joseph's act, but she could understand his motives. They had all been victims of the Montgomery family's cruelty. A police officer appeared and began talking with Joseph. Oliver gripped his mother's hand tightly. "Will he go to prison?" Oliver asked softly. "I don't know," Margaret answered honestly. "But we'll do what we can for him." At that moment, the door to Eleanor's hospital room opened, and a nurse came out. "Miss Hudson, your mother would like to see you." Margaret took a deep breath and told Oliver, "Wait here." She steeled herself and headed toward the hospital room. A year had passed since the incident. Margaret Hudson was looking out the window of her new office, coffee in hand. The sign, Hudson Culinary Publishing, was proudly displayed facing the street. The month following the incident had been tumultuous. Joseph was arrested for tampering with food, but considering the circumstances, the judge gave him a relatively light sentence of 6 months of community service and probation. There was insufficient evidence, but Richard and Victoria also avoided aggressive prosecution, fearing they might be sued for mistreating employees. Oliver was spared legal consequences due to his age and the circumstances, on the condition that he receive counseling. However, the emotional wounds weren't easily healed. He suffered from nightmares for several months, and Margaret sought professional help for her son's recovery. Meanwhile, Margaret's relationship with her mother Eleanor took an unexpected turn. While hospitalized, Eleanor demanded to know why this happened. Margaret frankly expressed her years of frustration and anger. That night, Eleanor cried for the first time and admitted, "I was wrong." This became a catalyst for her to reconsider her daughter-in-law's arrogance and the unfair treatment of Margaret. Victoria and Richard tried to act as if nothing had happened, but their reputation in the community was severely damaged. Richard's medical clinic, in particular, faced financial difficulties as patients decreased. They still hadn't changed their attitudes, but Connor was beginning to change. After the incident, he approached his cousin Oliver, and they gradually developed a friendship. A knock on the door interrupted Margaret's thoughts. "Come in." Joseph entered with a smile. Having completed his community service, he now worked at Margaret's publishing house. With Eleanor's financial support, Margaret had established the small cookbook publishing company she had dreamed of for years, with Joseph as her first author. "The final proofreading is complete," Joseph handed her the manuscript. "The Joy of Simple Meals, finally ready for publication." "Wonderful," Margaret took the manuscript. "How many pre-orders?" "More than expected," Joseph's eyes shone with joy. "We also have an interview scheduled with the Boston Globe." Their conversation was interrupted when Oliver burst into the office after school. "Mom! Connor's here. Can we go to the library together?" Margaret smiled at her son's bright expression. The childlike sparkle had returned to Oliver's eyes. "Of course. Be back for dinner." After Oliver left, Joseph came to stand beside Margaret at the window. "He's a strong child." "Yes, he really is," Margaret nodded. "We all had to become strong, didn't we?" As they gazed out the window in silence, a mail carrier entered. "Miss Hudson, a letter for you." Opening the envelope, she found it was from Victoria. "Margaret, I need to talk to you. Richard's clinic is in a critical situation, and we need help." Margaret closed the letter and turned to Joseph. "Life is ironic, isn't it? Sometimes forgiveness is stronger than revenge," Joseph said quietly. Margaret thoughtfully gazed out the window. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but perhaps possible. As she watched Oliver and Connor walking down the street, she felt hope for a new future. Life sometimes offers lessons in unexpected ways, sometimes in forms as simple as a piece of meat.